Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 37 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Vancouver Canucks and lost by a score of 4-3. And there was a lot of pre-game excitement about this one because it was Macklin Celebrini's first game against his hometown team, against the team that he grew up a fan of, the Vancouver Canucks. And you might be thinking, well, haven't the Sharks already played the Canucks this season? And you would be correct, but Celebrini did not dress for that game because he was still injured, and that game was in San Jose. Here tonight, it being in Vancouver makes it just a little bit more special as a kind of full circle type of moment for him with his friends and family in attendance. And as we know, the NHL and the media loves a story like this, especially for a first overall pick. And so a lot of hype coming into this game, but pushing that to the side just from a San Jose Sharks perspective, they were looking for a good performance here tonight because their last few games have not only been losses, but it is in the manner that they have lost those games that have been honestly quite embarrassing. In these last few games, the Sharks have either had a lead going into the third period or have established a lead early on in the third period, and in each of these last few games, they have ended up losing it anyway, most of the time in regulation. So the Sharks wanting to get a victory here, especially since they would be heading into the holiday break, a mandated few days off for every single NHL team. You want to go in there with a victory under your belt on a high note with some good vibes. And honestly, the Sharks, they played a quite solid game here for about 58 minutes here tonight. The Sharks, you could argue, were the better team than Vancouver. The problem for the Sharks, of course, was those 2 minutes that were just an absolute disaster for them. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. It starts off in the first period. The Sharks, for the first half of this first period, are looking rather solid, and then it ends up with a Canucks penalty that gives the Sharks a power play to work with, where Willie Mecklin gets absolutely run over by huge Canucks defenseman Tyler Myers. But Eklund, as they say, you take a hit to make a play. He gets back up. A few seconds later, he draws a penalty, and then he makes the Canucks pay with this 5-on-3 power play goal to make it 1-0 San Jose. However, the Canucks would manage to tie this one up with a goal from Brock Besser, and so it would be 1-1 at the end of the first period. In the second, for the first 15 or so minutes, again, the Sharks are looking rather solid. They're not getting many chances for themselves, but they're not giving the Canucks a lot to work with either. Kind of like the prototypical road game that a lot of coaches love to talk about. But then came that disastrous 2 minutes, and it starts off with this Kiefer Sherwood goal. It is a giveaway at the blue line, the offensive zone blue line, by Barclay Goodrow. Catches Henry Thrun a little bit out of position because of that, and so while he does have the angle on Sherwood, it gets him into a pretty good scoring position where he sends a really nice shot that does beat Askarov, and that makes it 2-1 Vancouver. Just less than a minute later, it is a Macklin Celebrini giveaway, again near the offensive zone blue line, that ends up with this Pettersson goal. Now, this one does get challenged for goaltender interference by Ryan Warsofsky, and I can certainly understand the perspective here. It is quite clear that Garland does interfere with Askarov and prevents him from being able to get his best chance of making this save on Pettersson because his stick is wrapped around Garland, so he can't really get control of it. However, I also do understand where the referees and where the NHL are coming from when they decide to let this goal stand, because Garland is outside of the crease and the NHL does not want to discourage players from going to the front of the crease and screening the goaltender. And especially if you call this one back, you do potentially open up a can of worms where suddenly goaltenders are wrapping their sticks around players who are screening them in front and then saying like, hey, this guy interfered with me. Maybe not a path that the NHL wants to go down. So honestly, I could have seen this one getting called back. It would not have really surprised me, but it was honestly a 50-50 as most of these goaltender interference calls are. And I'm certainly not extremely upset that the Sharks end up getting burned here by the officiating. But what ends up happening is because of this, they get the delay of game call, and the Sharks immediately take another penalty after that, giving the Canucks a 5-on-3 of their own, where Pettersson scores again, and now it is a 4-1 lead for the Canucks. These last 2 or so minutes here, pretty disastrous, as I've said. Now, heading into the third period, the message from Ryan Warsofsky was quite clear, which was to shoot the puck. Very simple message, but the problem here for the Sharks was that, like in the game against the Jets, and like in the game against the Avalanche, many of these shots are just of the low percentage variety, which against a great goaltender like Thatcher Demko aren't usually going to be able to go in. Now, the CC one is, I guess, the reason for why you take these low percentage shots, because sometimes they take 2 deflections off of 2 Canucks players and end up getting past the goaltender. That can happen, but you would have liked to see the Sharks create a bit more of a commotion near the net to really give them a chance of coming back in this game, because after this CC goal, while the Sharks are getting some zone time, they're not actually getting many high danger chances, and it takes until the 6-on-5 where suddenly things open up a little bit more thanks to that extra player on the ice, and it is Luke Cunnin scoring his 10th of the season with just 5 seconds to go to bring it to within 1. Not enough time, however, to fully get that game tied, and so the Sharks will head into that holiday break with yet another loss. They certainly had a solid effort here tonight, but they really let it get away with them from them due to, once again, a few major mistakes. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line of Celebrini and Toffoli being joined by Mikael Granlund. And this one at first kind of surprised me to see Celebrini and Toffoli separated from Kovalenko. I didn't think Kovalenko was great against the Oilers, but this had been the Sharks' best line over these last few games, so it surprised me again why they would be separated. But this seems like less of a punishment for someone like Kovalenko, but actually more of an opportunity to try and get Mikael Granlund rolling, because Granlund has actually been somewhat struggling as of late. Last game I thought he was all right against the Oilers, but in each of these last few he has been hemmed into his own zone. The defensive effort is there, but he hasn't really gotten to do much offensively. In fact, if we, coming into this game, look at his last 8, he only has 3 points during that time frame, which is in stark contrast to the first, let's say, quarter of this season where he was the best offensive player for the San Jose Sharks. So putting him with a dynamic player like Celebrini, it was a chance to try and unlock him a little bit in this game, and it didn't really work that well. Now, this is not to say that Granlund played a bad game necessarily. I thought he was all right, considering just the Sharks as a whole were quite good here tonight for much of this game. But the thing is that I was hoping for more of a standout type of performance, that he would manage to have some really strong chemistry with someone like Celebrini, and it just didn't really work out that way. Granlund was okay, but definitely not, I imagine, what Warsofsky was really hoping for. On the other side, on the wing, we have Tyler Toffoli, who I actually thought had a pretty decent game. It wasn't the most exciting of games for himself. There weren't a ton of great plays. There weren't any goals for himself either, but I thought he had a few slick plays. He has great entries into the zone. He's also a strong first pass out of the defensive zone as well, up high near the blue line, so I like when he's able to set up those passes. He did that a couple of times here tonight, and he's been doing that all season. Just like the types of moments that you don't fully notice that much, but you can appreciate when they do occur. And so Toffoli, it wasn't an exciting game, but he was definitely one of the Sharks' better forwards. And then, of course, we have Macklin Celebrini, and he probably had the most interesting game out of any San Jose Shark player. First of all, there seemed to be a little bit of, I don't know if nerves or maybe just general jitteriness in the early part of this one, because I talked about in my rookie update video yesterday how Celebrini in the earlier parts of this season had a tendency to overforce on certain plays. He tried to pass pucks to areas in which had like a 1% chance of actual success, and so it ended up just leading to multiple turnovers, and that recently Celebrini has cleaned that up and not been making plays like that. But here tonight, he kind of reverted back to that early season form. There were multiple of these types of Hail Mary attempts of 1-2% chance of actually succeeding, players just not being in the position that Celebrini thought they would be, and so it looked a little bit awkward here at times, especially through the first couple of periods. But as the game wore on, he certainly seemed to lock in. His third period, I thought he was really impressive, and even in those first couple of periods when most of his plays weren't working out, we still got to see his talent on display, which was quite nice. Good maneuvers in the neutral zone, being able to get around his man time and time again. But one thing that is really nice about Macklin Celebrini is that with other 18, 19, 20-year-old players in the NHL, these young guys, when they're not rolling offensively, they're kind of a liability because they don't really bring much else to the game, right? They have the incredible level of talent, but if it's not going for them on a particular night, you don't have much else doing. But with Celebrini, because he is still a solid defensive player, that even in a night where he's having these issues and having these giveaways, like on that third goal for the Vancouver Canucks, he can still be a positive impact player. So defensively, I thought Celebrini was rather solid, and then like I said, the third period it picked up. He started getting these shots on net. He started actually being willing to take a shot. We saw in the first period he had a great opportunity and he looked for the pass instead. Nobody knows why in that case, because he had a perfect lane to the net. So all in all, I would say it was a solid game for Celebrini, I guess. He picks up a couple of assists here as well, which actually puts him back onto a point per game pace, but definitely one that was filled with up and downs for sure. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, we have Eklund, Wenberg, and Smith. We'll start off with William Eklund, who had a great start to this game. As I mentioned, he takes that huge hit from Myers, but he's able to get up, he's able to draw a penalty and score a goal, and then an even strength play. He was also a pretty strong player for the San Jose Sharks. Unfortunately, Eklund does not return for the second or the third period of tonight's game. I imagine the injury isn't particularly severe, considering the fact that he was able to not only score that goal and then finish out the rest of the first period as well. I imagine this is more of a precautionary situation for the Sharks where they keep him out of the lineup. They have the Christmas break coming up. Let him sit out for these next few days so that he can be healthy enough to come in. Don't need to risk a potential re-aggravation of an injury by playing the last couple of periods of this game. So that's kind of like my optimistic point of view, because it would definitely be rough to lose Eklund. While he hasn't been super consistent as of late, when he's at his best, he's still one of the Sharks' best players on the ice, so you want to see him be okay. When it comes to his two line mates, there were obviously a lot of flux in the lineup because Eklund missed those last 40 minutes. Wenberg, not the greatest start. There was one play right near the beginning of the game that was a really, really bad one in the defensive zone that led to some good pressure for the Canucks, but past that point, I thought Wenberg actually played rather well. His ability to protect the puck in the offensive zone, I thought he showed that off multiple times here tonight, and so generally was a good player for the game. And then it comes to Will Smith. Smith had a relatively quiet night for sure, didn't really get many chances, didn't really get to make much of an impact, but compared to his earlier parts of the season where, I mentioned earlier on with the 18 and 19-year players, if they're not doing much offensively, they're just not doing much in general. Here tonight, I still thought Smith was doing some okay things from a defensive standpoint. We saw him a couple of times actually get the better of Quinn Hughes, which is a very big rarity. Quinn Hughes being one of the most dynamic defensemen in the entire game. He picks off a pass from him at one point. He beats him in a battle in the third period late deep in the defensive zone as well, or deep in, I guess, his own offensive zone. So there were moments in which Smith, I thought, actually showed off decently well and was an okay player here tonight, but obviously just didn't really get to do much in this game. Again, because of that Eklund flux in the lineup, and so he ends up, I think, only with about 11 or so minutes of ice time here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Cunnin, who ends up being the center here because, of course, Granlund ends up being the wing on that top line, and he's joined by Kovalenko and Zetterlund. I'll start off with Zetterlund, who I actually really liked in this position. I think what we're coming to learn this season is that Zetterlund is much more fitting for like a third, maybe second line role, not so much for a top line role. That was something that he was forced to do last season because the Sharks just didn't really have any help throughout their lineup. But with a little bit more depth, and as we move forward into the future, as the Sharks accumulate even more depth than that, I think Zetterlund will be better fitted for a middle six position. It's not necessarily at his best when he's forced to play like a skill game on a line with a Macklin Celebrini, and more so when he's able to crash the net, use his body, win battles along the boards, and that's what he was doing with relative consistency here tonight. And I think Warsofsky recognized that. He got the time on ice in the 6-on-5 situation for himself. He played well in front of the net there. He was crashing the boards. He was making things happen. He had some energy, so I appreciated Zetterlund's effort here tonight. With Luke Cunnin, I thought his game here tonight was all right. It wasn't anything outstanding, but you do obviously have to give credit for him being able to pick up this goal at the end. That is his 10th of the season. And if you had told me at the beginning of the season that Cunnin would have 10 goals, I would have thought he would score that 10th goal in maybe the 82nd game of the season, not before the halfway mark. He's on pace for over 20 goals at this point, which is absolutely absurd with how terrible he was last year. But Mike Greer decides to give him that prove-it contract, and prove it he absolutely has. You can't help but like what Cunnin has done for decent chunks of this season. And then the final player on this line, Kovalenko, kind of a similar game to the one he had against the Edmonton Oilers. He had a couple of slick plays here or there, managed to set up a decent rush chance occasionally, but generally as an all-around player for the Sharks, not the best of nights for him. Just kind of like a average game since the Sharks were looking pretty good themselves. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, they said it wasn't possible, they said it couldn't be done, but Barclay Goodrow found himself on the fourth line for the first time this season. Absolutely crazy. Warsofsky, mind-blowing that he could able to come to such a genius decision. Nobody could have ever thought that Barclay Goodrow could be a fourth liner, and yet here we are. And, Goodrow, I actually thought looked okay in this particular role. This is the role that I want to see him in. Let him get his penalty killing time. Let him get then 5-6 minutes of even strength ice time, whatever the case may be. He got a little bit more here tonight because of the injury to Willie Mecklin, but in a normal situation, that's what I want to see from him. And then that can be some good things for himself. Obviously, he had the giveaway that led to the Canucks' second goal, which is not good. Pretty bad giveaway for a veteran player. Usually at the time you say, well, a veteran player will dump the puck in while a young player will try to make a play. Goodrow does exactly that, and it backfires extremely hard. But I guess you can also appreciate the fight that he showed here tonight. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago in that game against the Utah Hockey Club that Goodrow just didn't really show up and assert himself physically in a game that was quite chippy and quite dirty at times. Here tonight, after Eklund gets run over by Tyler Myers, a few minutes later, Goodrow getting involved and being willing to fight such a big man like Tyler Myers, I do appreciate that. Generally, the game was all right for him, but it was actually his two line mates that I thought carried the show on this fourth line, because this fourth line was quite effective for the Sharks. Both Sturm and Dellandrea, for sure, making an effort here on the forecheck, intercepting plays. They didn't really generate much offensively. It felt as though they were a little bit out of sync in that area, but in terms of interrupting the Canucks and making sure they couldn't really get anything going, they did a very good job. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, I mentioned a couple of games ago with Carl Grundstrom that these players are kind of on the chopping block a little bit. Once Klim Kostin does return and is healthy, someone is going to have to sit out. And it might end up being Carl Grundstrom, it might end up being a Ty Dellandrea, it might end up being both of them if we're honestly speaking honestly here. But Ty Dellandrea, he gets the message, he wants to be involved, and he certainly does make an impact on the game. He also gets into a fight here. He takes an interference penalty, which was very, very clear interference, but at least it gets people going. It's some energy building type of moment. He was throwing himself around, as I said, strong on the forecheck, so I liked Ty Dellandrea and Nico Sturm's game tonight. Then we get to the defensive side of things, and there was a lot to like here defensively. There were a couple of these defensive pairings, Thrun and CC, Mukhamadullin and Ruda, were actually quite good. That was the reason for why the Sharks played a solid game, didn't really give the Canucks much to work with for 58 minutes here tonight. But then there was the Liljegren-Ferraro pairing, which is what we will start with. This was an absolute train wreck, a disaster. I mean, it wasn't completely awful terrible, but it's a situation where in comparison to the two other defensive pairings, they look significantly worse than them. Liljegren was actually quite good in the previous game against the Edmonton Oilers, which was surprising because the Sharks had to play so much in their own zone, which Liljegren is certainly his weakest point of his game, and yet he still managed to find some success. I was hopeful that he'd be able to carry it into the game here tonight against Vancouver, and he did anything but that. Liljegren was just a liability multiple times here on the ice. Ferraro, very much the same thing, you definitely have to say. And what was probably the most disappointing thing is that this is a game in which Jake Wallman misses out on due to injury. He does not play, and so this was a chance for Liljegren to kind of step up in a big way and be that offensive defenseman while Wallman is on the sidelines, and he did the quite opposite of that by instead stepping down in a massive way and playing a bad game. And then when it comes to Ferraro, as I already mentioned, just a disappointment for sure. His poor coverage, which was barely even coverage on, let's say, the Brock Besser goal that tied this game up at 1, just a really, really bad effort for sure. Like, if that was Mukhamadullin making a play like that, he would be benched for the next game. We know Ferraro probably won't be, unfortunately enough, but he probably should be at this point. When it comes to actually that third defensive pairing where I'm going to go to next, I want to talk about Mukhamadullin, because like with Celebrini, Mukhamadullin did have a very interesting game here tonight, because there were some negative moments for him for sure. There were times where he's trying to chip this puck out of the zone, but he doesn't really get much power onto it, and so it ends up being easily picked off. That does occur. There were also a couple of moments where he was a little bit out of sync with his teammates. Felt as though a couple of times where players were passing it up to the point and he was just in the wrong position, and so the puck ends up going out of the zone. But besides that, I thought Mukhamadullin showed a lot of offensive flair here tonight, not necessarily in terms of getting like great chances on net, but he was willing to skate with the puck a lot more. He was moving through the neutral zone. He was using his body a little bit more as well, which was quite nice to see. And so I thought he was actually all over the puck in a lot of these types of situations. He was getting multiple shifts late in this game as well, so Warsofsky seemed to be recognizing it. He still only hits up at about 16 minutes of ice time, but he actually beats Liljegren in that particular area. No surprise there. And so going into the next game, which will be on Friday after the holiday break here, if Jake Walman is available, one would think that Mukhamadullin would be the easy scratch, kind of like what he was against the Edmonton Oilers. But at this point, it seems hard to justify taking him out of the lineup. And on top of that, Jan Ruda, his defensive partner here tonight, also looked rather solid. And so this was a duo that looked quite good for the Sharks here tonight. And so it seems as though the likely candidate will probably end up being Liljegren stepping out, because if we take a look at the Sharks' first defensive pairing of Thrun and Ceci, they also looked all right. Not quite as good as Mukhamadullin or Ruda. Thrun, though, I think did an admirable job here. As we know, when Thrun is thrust into a position of actually playing tougher minutes, he has seemingly stepped up. In the past, when Wellman was injured for like 5-6 games there, Thrun took up the mantle of that top defensive pairing with Ceci and actually played some of his best hockey of the season. There were still a couple of mistakes for sure from Thrun. The usual situations where when he's very much under pressure from forecheck, and the Canucks did forecheck quite hard here tonight. He did struggle a little bit. He panicked a little bit, but more often than not, I thought he was rather solid. The same would go for Cody Ceci. He manages to score a goal here tonight, even if it wasn't necessarily the most skilled goal. Definitely a lot of luck involved there, but defensively, I thought he was also pretty decent. So all in all, outside of that really terrible game for the Sharks' second defensive pairing, things didn't look too bad. And then it comes to the Sharks goaltender. Askarov gets another start here, the second straight now after putting up a really, really great performance a couple of days ago against the Edmonton Oilers. Askarov here tonight, he certainly wasn't bad. I would say it was a bit of a tough game because after the Oilers game where he faced 40 plus shots, he gave a post-game interview, and in that interview he had mentioned that as a goaltender, it's almost easier when you're facing a ton of shots because it allows you to really stay engaged in the game. But when you're only facing a shot here or there, suddenly you kind of get caught a little bit off guard because it's hard to stay fully focused. And so Askarov here, he wasn't facing a lot of shots, and maybe that did indeed get to him. The Besser one, he didn't have a ton of a chance on. Maybe he could have made the save, but I won't really blame him on. The Sherwood one is very much the same. This is a great shot by Sherwood, but you could say maybe Askarov could have made that save. The Pettersson one, obviously the first one he's a little bit interfered with, even if this doesn't actually get called back, so it's a tough one. And then the second Pettersson one, a 5-on-3, you never really blame a goaltender on a 5-on-3, so can't put too much blame there. But at the end of the day, he does let in 4 goals, so maybe not his best outing as a San Jose Shark. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, so they'll have 3 days off here. They'll be taking on the Vegas Golden Knights. The first time the Sharks played the Golden Knights this season, they got crushed. I believe a 7-3 loss, so they'll be looking for a little bit of revenge and finally to try and get back into the win column. Class dismissed.